So I recently had a very short article published in Göttingen Mittelland, which publishes articles in German, English and French. It's a Göttingen University thing. And this is part of the first page of my two-page article. But before I go on to that, I'll just use my low-tech strips of paper to say a word about the third intermediate period. This is the third intermediate period in 10 years to the inch on the orthodox chronology. So you can possibly see the green numbers. Dynasty 20 at the top is the end of the New Kingdom, and that's about 1100 BC at the top. And then down the bottom, the 26th dynasty, and sort of it's about 600 BC down there. The bit I'm going to talk about today is more the sort of later part of the third intermediate period, which I want to suggest take out about at least 50 years, a couple of generations. And obviously, as Barry said, we've all got to try and shorten this third intermediate period. And there's no mistake, this is the Orthodox dynasty 22, 23, 24, 25 in parallel at that stage. So it's not impossible to have parallel dynasties. So the start of my article. Now, Osorkon III and PA, better known as Pianki, it seems the Ankh is not necessarily part of his name. When Pianki of the 25th dynasty here from Nubia or Kush, when he invaded Egypt, he mentions an Osorkon, who is generally thought to be Osorkon IV. Some revisionists think, including myself, that it's actually Osorkon III, and there's now new evidence which strongly suggests this, whereas the Orthodox chronology has to invent an Osorkon IV to be contemporary with Pianki. The announcement of the discovery of some blocks of Osorkon III at Tanis, combined with 4 recent articles, reinforces the case for a greater overlap between dynasties 22, 23 and dynasty 25. Osorkon III allied with and later subject to the 25th dynasty. So what I'm going to suggest is that something like that, and then Osorkon III will indeed be a contemporary of Pianki, of PA. So the second paragraph. In the past, Osorkon III has sometimes been identified with the Osorkon named on Pianki Stealer as a ruler of Bubastis and likely also Tanis, both places in the East Delta. And the people who suggested this in the past was Breasted, who wrote Ancient Records of Egypt about 100 years ago, and in Centuries of Darkness it was also suggested. Osorkon III is well known from Thebes in southern Egypt, but not from the East Delta, and it's generally been assumed that PA's Osorkon should be numbered 4, particularly as Osorkon III is thought to have died about 30 years before PA's campaign. However, with these new blocks from Tanis, Osorkon III is now clearly attested at Tanis, and the 2 items that were thought to belong to Osorkon IV have also become doubtful. They've been reattributed. Right now, so here's the Egyptian Delta, and Tanis is somewhere in this area. I'm not sure where exactly on that map. Here's one of the blocks, just as an example. There's some very nicely cut ones, good quality blocks, unfortunately reused in the sides of a sacred lake. So they're not in their original building and they're all mixed up. Here's another rather strange one. I don't know if you've ever seen Egyptian art looking quite like this before, but I hope you can see there's two identical figures facing in opposite directions with the skin plate painted blue. Anyway, there's lots of these decorated blocks, not necessarily all from the same building. And here's the Google map of Tanis. On the left you can see the modern town, and on the right the ruin field where the excavations have taken place. The Ammon temple is there, and the Mut temple, which is the one that I'm going to talk about, is there. And the modern name apparently is, they call it San al-Hajjah. Now here's a closer up view with the Ammon temple again and the Mut temple to the south. And while we're on this picture, I'll just digress a bit. You'll know, some of you will know that in the new chronology, the 21st dynasty and the 22nd dynasty get put in parallel. And the evidence, some of the evidence for that, if not all of it, comes from the Ammon temple. The main building was sort of roughly here in this larger enclosure, and the royal tombs of the early to mid Third Intermediate period were here, and strangely it appeared that the tombs were in the wrong order, built in the wrong order. There's a tomb of Susenes I and a tomb of Osorkon II next to each other. But it seems as if Osorkon II was built first before Susenes I's, or possibly at the same time. Also over here, I wrote about, that by the way is in David Roll's Test of Time book, and in Chronology and Catastrophism Review I've written an article on a later discovery. They excavated a strange elliptical pit there, and from that the sequence seemed to be, with no time in between them, the overall conclusion that Susenes I and Osorkon II were at the same time. Anyway, that's an aside on the earlier period. Now, this is as big as you can go on Google Street View, Google Maps. So we've got the Mut temple here, and Street View doesn't work for ancient Tanis. But this is apparently a 2012 map, so it's bang up to date. The entrance to this temple enclosure was in the north, and as far as I can gather, I think the main temple was sort of in this area, at least at the sort of period we're dealing with in the late Third Intermediate period. And the sacred pool was down here, where these blocks were reused in the side of it. And this is a view from the north, so the other way around. The entrance in this area, the main temple down here, and the sacred lake sort of about here somewhere. Now this is looking south again, Yes, as on the previous slide. And this is the southwest corner of this sacred lake. And you can see the blocks that were reused in building this site of this lake. You can even see a bit the inscriptions on some of them, or the drawings rather. To give you an idea of scale, I think that is sort of something like the height of a man. And all this stuff they've had to dig through above is presumably, later Scythian, Hellenistic, Roman, Arab period, I don't know. And some of these strange constructions here are wells that I suppose were used to provide water for the lake and other purposes. Now, a view taken from a balloon. I think slightly before the other one. This time you can see the southeast corner, and the southwest corner that we were looking at before was less excavated at that point. And the main temple, as I said, was over here, and what they've marked as A, B, and C. A says wall of Ptolemy IV. I think the side temple wall from the Hellenistic period, and B is the Scythians in inverted commas wall. They're not quite sure whether it's 26th dynasty. The 26th dynasty is called Scythians. And there's also a deep wall C, which they also found. So the sacred lake, I don't know, it's somewhere extending like that. Now, this is the most interesting block, which went on the excavation website as it was found, and it was built into the wall upside down. Now, I might have given up at this point, but I thought about turning the computer screen upside down, but I realised that this is actually saying Osorkon. Now, I'll turn it the right way up. And it does in fact say Usamatre Osorkon. Now, the way it's written was only used by Osorkon III. Now, if you remember, I said Osorkon III was thought only to be attested at Thebes in southern Egypt, but now here suddenly he turns up in the East Delta. So Usamatre Osorkon III. This is his crown, in fact the crown of southern Egypt, and presumably his head was here and his body. And he is facing to the goddess Mut, who you can see at the front of her crown under Uraeus. And here it says apparently Mut, Lady of Isharu, I think, whatever that means. So you've got the king facing the goddess. And as this is the Mut temple, presumably the block came from somewhere else, an earlier building in the same temple complex. Now this is the man himself, this time wearing the crown of northern Egypt, and you can see part of his Usamatre cartouche there. And here's a list of all these Osorkons. Two of them were thought to be, are known to be called Usamatre, Osorkon II and Osorkon III. And the Osorkon IV that they, I think, invented to have somebody contemporary with Pianki, he was thought to be called Archepere. But in a 2000 article, also in Göttinger Mitzeln, the two items that had been attributed to him were reattributed to Osorkon IV, or the Elder, who is also called Archepere. We lose the prenomen, and the question is, does he exist at all? Now, I can possibly take questions as we go along, but we've only got 25 minutes left, haven't we? So I won't. Let's move on. Now, the Pianki Stealer, which is where Pianki mentions Osorkon, this is the top half of it. It describes his campaign of conquest from Thebes, where it seems he was already in control in southern Egypt. And he advances north and defeats various people who have been opposing him, in particular Takelot II, who was pharaoh in the West Delta and had been trying to take over all Egypt. And there's a scene at the top with the various kings and princes that became subject to PA, which I'll move on to. And you can see here Pianki, who's been somewhat rubbed out, I presume, by a later enemy. And behind him is the god Ammon, and behind him the goddess Mut. There's various princes, rulers of different parts of Egypt, bowing down over here. And on the right side there's 4 pharaohs. This is Nimrod of Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt, who's offering Pianki a nice horse, and it seems also his wife if he wants her. And the 3 pharaohs below bowing down are Osorkon. I think the name is damaged, but it's probably taken from lower down in the text somewhere. Uput and Pef-Juali-Bast. I think Uput was a pharaoh in the Delta, and Pef-Juali-Bast was another Middle Egyptian pharaoh. So it's because of this stele that we have to have an Osorkon contemporary with Pia, which I say should be Osorkon III. But I sent my article to various experts on the subject, and several of them, I regret to say, have now come up with the idea that we've got yet another Usamatre Osorkon as Osorkon IV. Well, it's possible that it's not what I think is the case. Okay, so now I move on to these 4 articles, which I think combined all strongly point to this sort of 2-generation plus compression of this period. The first one is in Journal of the Ancient Chronology Forum, the one that David Roll started, by a Canadian, Jean-Frédéric Brunet, the 22nd and 25th Dynasty Apis burial conundrum. Now, you may know that there is a burial chambers at Memphis called the Serapeum, where they used to bury these sacred bulls. And when one bull died, another one was taken to replace him, rather like the Dalai Lama gets replaced by somebody else born at the same time. And in the Serapeum, the earlier ones are in rather small chambers off a central corridor, and they were excavated in the 19th century and a little bit again in 1980s. Many people in ancient Egyptian times, they dedicated small stone stelae to these bulls when they died. So they will mention the name of the dedicant and possibly some other details like who was the pharaoh, what year the bull died. So this is the top half of one that died in the year 2 of Pime. So on the right you've got actually 2 or possibly 3 people worshipping the Apis bull, portrayed as a man with a bull's head, and behind him another goddess, Hathor. And that's Pime's prenome, and that's the end of his the name Pime, obviously damaged on this side, and I think that's probably the where it says year 2. Now if I just go back to the other one. And Brunet works these on the longer chronology of the Orthodox chronology. It's no problem, they all come in sequence, but there's too many of them there seem to be too many of them to fit into the shortened chronology. However, if a bull dies here, obviously the dedicants could use the name of any of 3 different pharaohs. And Brunet suggested that some of these bulls, which were thought to be separate, are actually the same, using his numbering. Apis 3 is the same as Apis 6, and Apis 4 is the same as Apis 7, and 5 is the same as 8. So he made an attempt to fit these all together into a shorter chronology. A lot of these stelae don't only give a year, they'll actually give a month and a day. Some of them give the date of burial, and some of them give the date of death. So normally there was a 70-day embalming period between death and burial. But there also, occasionally, there were some stelae that were dedicated after the event by a short time as well. So there's a bit of scope for arguing about the exact date. Now, how about this one? This apparently is year 14 of Takelot, but to what extent you can rely on the month and the day, I'm not quite sure. I've looked up sort of some of it's a mixture of hieroglyphs and hieratic, and that does seem to be a year sign, and that seems to be a hieratic 10. And here's 1, 2, 3, 4, so, and it's reading from right to left, I should say. So it does seem to be year 14, and that apparently is a cartouche of Takelot. But as you can see, there are sort of difficulties reading this sort of stuff. Now, Takelot is in the 25th dynasty, the Kushite one, he's there. Now this is the second article by 2 of the authors of Centuries of Darkness. Pef Bast, King of Nennesut, Genealogy, Art History and the Chronology of Late Libyan Egypt. Now, Pef Bast was the minor king who appeared on the Pianki Stealer, and Nennesut is Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt. And they produce a genealogy in this article, and they link a high priest of Memphis, Pef Bast, to this king, Pef Bast, who on the Orthodox chronology are about 50 years apart. They published in an Argentinian journal, Antiquio Oriente, the editor of whom was known to them and to John Bimpson, but it is available on the web. In fact, I've actually got a handout I meant to distribute with some of these references on. And Morcott's speciality is the 25th dynasty, and the styles of the dress and the way they were portrayed. It was at this time, at the end of the Libyan dynasties and the beginning of the 25th, that they were starting to use styles from previous periods, archaizing styles. So just reading a little bit of this, this paper argues in detail for the identification of Pef Bast, king of Nennesut, with Pef Bast, high priest of Ptah in Memphis. known from the Pianki Stealer of year 28 of Shortening III. This identification ties in with a significant lowering of the accepted dates for the kings from Shortening III, Osorkon III, Takelot III, Shortening V. So everything from here down to there, yeah, that lot. And some quotes from their article referring to one of those Pianki Stealer, the musculature of the legs, a detail that is well known as a characteristic of archaizing sculpture in the Kushite period, the 25th dynasty. So that was a 22nd dynasty stealer, but with art style from the 25th dynasty period. Well, you know, no problem now, we've got the 25th and the 22nd well overlapped. And another example, the goddess Hathor, that's taken from that stealer I showed you, and then another one from the same year, that one with the head missing, and they compare that style with the 25th dynasty style, a different goddess here, and they particularly pick out the broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist with prominent curved forward thigh. So, you know, again, the art styles are making a compression of the chronology. And a few more quotes from that same article. The reliefs of the Hecajet chapel that depict Takelot III, Takelot III here, wearing a short kilt with broad pleats that normally characterise 25th dynasty archaism. Okay, well, we can do it now. And another aspect from their article, they quote Aston and Taylor, these are experts on the third intermediate period, who have had problems with generation jumps and late dates for statues and coffins of the descendants of Takelot III, who seem to come after 700 BC. So it's this guy's descendants are apparently down here, here, which is fine as that is, one generation later, at least. But as I originally had the diagram, that would be down here. And so they say the case is extremely strong for suggesting that conventional dates for the reigns of Osorkon III and Takelot III should be lowered, at the very least, it's emphasised, by 25 years. Less generation jump would then be required between the family of Takelot III and the individuals, his descendants, who can be dated after 700. And this is a table from their article. If you look at the right-hand three columns, you can see they've got pretty much the same as I've got with Osorkon III, Pime and PA, all about the same period. There's Beth-Joari Bastaz, High Priest of Memphis, and a bit later he was another king. The third article, this one was by me, in the Journal of the American Research Centre in Egypt. Some of you will remember Laskin, he also once had an article in this journal. And what I published was this genealogical chart, which is made up mainly of genealogies taken from Kitchen's Third Intermediate Period book. And the rest of the 5-page article was more or less just explaining this chart. You don't obviously can't understand this very fully just at the moment, but there are on the left side I put the pharaohs, Shoshet I onwards, down to Sam-Tek of the 26th dynasty. So we're talking sort of there to there. I've sort of plotted out some of the genealogies from Kitchen's book. This one of the fourth prophets of Ammon. The Orthodox chronology sticks an extra couple of generations in this line with no real justification. There's another line down through the middle here, which is one generation longer than the Orthodox chronology, but part of this part here depends on a now lost inscription on a piece of a coffin that was in Cairo in the 19th century, but subsequently lost. All we've got is somebody had copied out the genealogy. He may have made a mistake. And I argue in the article with good reason, I think, that there's actually one less generation in that one. And the third main part of the diagram is this side, where it splits. There, in Kitchen's book, there is a 2-generation or 3-generation by one route, and a 4 or 5 generation by the other route. Now, the Orthodox chronology accepts the longer version. I've taken the shorter version and assumed an error in the longer version, which is quite complicated, made up of a number of different genealogies. And so I was able to produce this chart, and I challenged anybody else to provide a better one. Nobody has so far. It was dated 2008. I think they were behind schedule. It didn't come out till 2010. So somebody might yet take me up on that challenge. The fourth and final article I want to draw your attention to is by Ad Thijs, a Dutchman, and he was writing in the Zeitschrift für Ägyptische Sprache, which I think is the oldest German Egyptological journal. So he did well to get it into that, I think. And he brings in astronomical evidence. So his title, The Lunar Eclipse of Takelot II and the Chronology of the Libyan Period. I'll read what he says. In this article, the author presents an ultra-short chronology for the Libyan period. After having established tentative dates for the kings from Takelot II to Shoshenq V, solely on the basis of historical material, for example, Apis burials, and he leans heavily on Brunei's work that I've just mentioned, and non-Egyptian sources. He refers particularly to the Egyptian statuary that's been found at Byblos and in Spain. And the resulting model is tested using astronomical evidence, which ultimately leads to the discovery of the famous missing eclipse of the year 15 of Takelot II, an awkward problem that has haunted Egyptology for years. So Takelot II is here. There's an inscription from his time which seems to suggest that there either was or wasn't an eclipse in his year 15. Now, on the Orthodox chronology, this is 800 and something, and there is no eclipse that one can find by astronomical retro calculations. But there is one in 756 BC which seems to fit the bill, which is 756 is where I and he would like to date as Takelot II. So a few quotes from his article referring to the missing eclipse of year 15 of Takelot II. Now he refers to the Chronicle of Prince Osorkon. Prince Osorkon subsequently became Osorkon III, as is now mostly accepted, although not, I think, by Kitchen still. yes, this Prince Osorkon wrote an inscription on the wall at Karnak in the Bubastite portal, just near to Shoshenk I's great inscription. And he says on this inscription, in the regnal year 15, which is Takelot II, 4th month of Shomu, day 25, although the sky did not swallow up the moon, a great convulsion broke out in this land. Children of rebellion, they stirred up civil strife. So it's this rather odd phrase that the sky did not swallow up the moon. Is that an eclipse or is it not? As Kitchen put it, for over a century scholars have been divided between those who sought to interpret this as an allusion to a lunar eclipse and those who have denied that any eclipse is required by this passage, given the crystal clear negative sign before the verb and nouns. Well, this eclipse in 756 BC does seem to fit the passage because it was a penumbral eclipse, which means that the Earth's shadow on the moon is smaller than the diameter of the moon. The moon must be a bit further away at that point. And so you get the moon is a ring, a hollow ring. So it's true that the sky did not entirely swallow up the moon, but there was nevertheless a notable astronomical event, which seems to be what this is referring to. And Tice says the bottom two lines, from a strictly logical point of view, interpretations along the lines of a great convulsion broke out although there was no eclipse simply fails to convince. So there must have been something, or he wouldn't have mentioned it. And I think that is it. Yes, spot on.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That's remarkable.